Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am Reverend Zenshin Florence Caplow, and I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister in full fellowship and also a Soto Zen priest and teacher.
That's amazing. Can you tell me a little bit about how your path led you to this place?
Sure. So I was raised UU in a small fellowship in Indiana. And and my mother, I'm actually sixth generation Midwestern UU, entirely down the women's line.
Wow.
So my great grandmother, great, yes, um, was part of a little group in a tiny little town who invited the Reverend Mary Safford to come and found a congregation in that Cherokee, Iowa in the 1890. So I feel like I was really raised, like I'm UU, in my bones, really. Uh,
Taproot right down to the prophetic sisterhood. That's incredible.
Absolutely. I knew about my family. I actually didn't know it was that many generations back. And I didn't know about the Mary Safford connection. And for those of you people who don't know, there was a group of really powerful women ministers in the late 19th century, based in Iowa, although in other states too. And Mary Safford was more or less and she did the lead, and she did a huge amount of church planting.
Right.
And Cherokee, Iowa was one of the places where there was a church plant.
That
And it
is
was
so
my
cool.
family that was part of the founding mothers. So I feel like my mother, really, with everything she did, with how she lived her life, with how she was with me, I learned UU values and the feeling of being engaged around justice issues was just, it was the air I breathed as a kid. But I also had a really strong spiritual call, I would say, and especially for anybody who grew up in a Midwestern UU fellowship, mid-century or a little bit later. It was very humanist atheist oriented, and so this need I had of asking big existential questions and being able to explore that, I wasn't actually able to get that in a UU context. And so I did lots of reading as a teen, and I was already reading books about Buddhism, but there weren't any teachers or anything like that in Indiana in the 1970s, early 80s. And it wasn't until I moved to the West Coast that I actually had a chance to learn Buddhist meditation. And so that was about 1984. So it's actually been 40 years, which is pretty wild, that my primary spiritual practice has been in the Buddhist tradition.
And so what does formation look like to what process did you move through to become a Buddhist priest?
It's much more organic than what and in fact, I became a Zen Buddhist priest before I went back to seminary to become a UU minister.
Oh, interesting.
So, but it is a more organic process. There's no seminary, there's nothing like that. It's really years and years of working closely with a teacher and within a community, within a Sangha. And what my teacher, Norman Fisher, who is also a whatever bi-religious or trans-religious person, he's strongly rooted in Judaism and also a Zen Buddhist teacher. What he always said is, before, and you're invited to ordain by and there's lay ordination and priest ordination by your teacher. And what he always said is that he looks for people who are already living their lives in a way that is the life of a priest, which in some ways is not so different from being UU. It's living a life of service. Mm-hmm. And having that commitment to both waking up and deepening in wisdom and compassion personally, but also giving out into the world. And so For me, it was about 17 years between when I first started working with that teacher and when I ordained as a priest. And then there's a very long time after ordination where you continue to work very closely with your teacher. And for the first 5 years, you never teach, you never speak publicly, you're still in formation. And then there's a point where you're again invited by your teacher to, as it's called, sort of share the teaching seat for a practice period, which is a time of intensive practice. And from then you can begin to actually work with people and teach, but you're still kind of under supervision by your teacher until Dharma transmission, which is, for me, was just a little over a year ago. And so that's after 40 years of Buddhist meditation practice and 30 years of Zen practice.
Wow.
So now I'm completely sort of equivalent of full fellowship in the Zen tradition as well. So long journey and lots of retreat time and living monastically and all of that. That is part of that.
So more organic, but also more more in depth. I mean,
and almost more like an apprenticeship, really, modeled, which of course we have in our Universalist ministers, particularly. That was the model in the 19th century.
Right.
It was an apprenticeship.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then how does your Unitarian Universalism merge, and when did the call to UU ministry come through?
I really believe that, I mean, when I look at the timing, it was a little over a year after my ordination as a Zen priest. And I was living in a little town, I was living in Flagstaff, Arizona. And I was actually in the middle of a kind of health crisis. I was supposed to start graduate school and I wasn't able to start. And I wandered in to Beacon UU there in Flagstaff. And it had been a long time since I'd really been active in a UU congregation. And it just moved me to my core at the time. It was a very profound experience. It was a time when gay marriage was legal in California. It hadn't yet kind of gone through the time when it wasn't, and not legal in Arizona. And so people from the congregation who'd been together for decades were going to California and getting married and then coming back and celebrating. And they had joys and sorrows, celebrating in joys and sorrows. And people would be clapping and cheering and crying. And I would be crying in the back. And I thought, these are my people. These are utterly and completely my people. And so that's really where it started. And I reached out to Reverend James Ford, who is a senior UU minister, now retired, and also a Zen priest and teacher. And I said, is this crazy to think about actually doing this? And he had lots of good advice for me. One was, don't even attempt seminary or ministry unless your health is better. But he was very encouraging, and he remained a mentor for me really through much of my journey towards seminary and ministry. And he is part of. There's actually a UU Buddhist Fellowship. It's a national organization of people that have some kind of Buddhist practice within a UU context. And he was one of the founders of that. And I'm on the board now and have been for more than 10 years. So I feel like I'm kind of walking in his footsteps. I took I think my ordination and first ministry was very close to his time of retiring. And as far as I know, we're the only two that have that kind of fully dual. So part of what I say, a friend asked me, who's also a practitioner, Buddhist practitioner in seminary, what do you feel? Are you like 60-40 Buddhist in UU, 20-80? Like what's the proportion? And just clear as a bell, I said, no, I'm 100 and 100.
Yes.
There's no difference. For me, it's literally that for me to be a UU minister is an expression of my vows as a Zen Buddhist priest, and to be a Zen Buddhist priest and to live a life of service is exactly what I was taught by my mother, who knew
Wow.
nothing about Buddhism, but was utterly a UU.
Mhm.
So, and um, a few years after I was ordained, I began working on a project that was a book collecting stories of Buddhist women from the time of the Buddha all the way through China and Japan and up until the present day. And that book came out in 2013. And I realized afterwards, oh, how my mother taught women's art history. She was one of the first people to bring forward the forgotten women artists. And I feel like that was an express. I mean, again, this line of women, of UU women, and here I brought forward the voices of Buddhist women, and that book is, um, it's changed the conversation within Buddhist practice centers. So
Beautiful.
yeah.
Wow. So, what are the ways that your Unitarian Universalism supports your Buddhist practice and faith, and vice versa?
So one of the things that I see as a weakness within a lot of American Buddhism, not everywhere, is there is this kind of sub area of engaged Buddhism or eco dharma, people working around climate change. But the kind of main force, unlike UU, is can get very inward, very much focused on personal awakening. And I think, and I mean, the teachers I've been drawn to working with are not, that is not their approach. My longtime teacher, Norman Fisher, the motto of Everyday Zen is changing and being changed by the world, which I feel like is very, very much in alignment with our commitments as UUs. So that's a place where I feel like UU understandings can really inform Buddhism. But I also see that when we work on the various things we work on, whether it's racial justice, homelessness, peace, climate change, that work is really, really hard. It's really easy to be discouraged. It's really easy to be cynical. You end up with sometimes groups fighting each other. And activists really need spiritual practices that can sustain them. And so just yesterday, I was doing a guest preaching at a small congregation online, and I was talking about the work of Joanna Macy, who was an incredibly important Buddhist activist. Where her whole teaching is about how to face the difficulties that we all know are right in our faces with some grace, some being able to love our life as it is now. And these are really important teachings because otherwise people burn out, they give up, they turn away. And so I love that, I don't know, somewhere between 10 and 20% of UU congregations across the country have some kind of Buddhist practice group within them. Because again, it's not the medicine for everyone, but I think it's a really important perspective. Because otherwise then it's all outward, right? And there's none of that developing the capacity to be with the suffering that's part of the world.
Exactly. I feel like there's space to expound a little bit more on being present with the suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think fundamentally, again, I think about our history, right, as Unitarians and Universalists. It's always been focused on uh, making a change. I think about all the great social movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. We were right in there and way out of proportion to the number of Unitarians or Universalists that were around at the time. And So there's this feeling of like, yes, part of our mission is to make a difference in the world. And yet, um, that means coming into direct contact with intense suffering, whether it's the suffering of poverty or gun violence or war or climate change. And if we don't have some way that we can stay steady and grounded as we are um, attempting to make change, knowing that some change works and some change doesn't, or it works on a very slow scale. Yes, there may be an arc that bends towards justice, but it can be agonizingly slow. It can take generations. Right? I think about the movement for women's suffrage and how long that took. My grandmother in 1920 was, voted in the first election that women could vote in, right? So how to have the capacity, to have the patience, have the capacity to stay with that suffering. There's an expression that's used in engaged Buddhism of bearing witness, to be willing to bear witness, and to come from that place of not turning away, of not psychically numbing, but being open and loving and willing to be changed, not just this kind of one way, oh, I'm going to help the world, but actually letting what we encounter change us. I just, for me, that's how I need to live. That's how I need to approach doing justice work, is in um, that expression. And I find that more and more, when I preach, and I was lead minister here in Urbana for a number of years, I probably preached less directly about Buddhism than a lot of ministers who are not Buddhist, but every single sermon I gave was completely imbued with those understandings. And now I often give sermons that are really direct, like there's a sermon I've given a number of times on Buddhist practices for resilience and renewal, because I feel like people really need that. In February, I'm going to be preaching at All Souls in New York, and I'm doing a service on spiritual practices for the Anthropocene. Like, okay, how do we do this?
How do we do this?
How do we do this? Because we all know what we're carrying around and generally not talking about. And it's a whole well of suffering.
Sure is.
So, and that's true for everyone, almost no
Past,
matter
present,
what.
and future.
Yes, exactly. So, so I love that I can bring that to UUs, because I love the work we do, and I really want to support us in that work. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Are there places of where the two rub, where your two faiths rub against one another, places of friction or dissonance, or are there things that are challenging about living 100% Buddhist, 100% Unitarian Universalist?
Not really.
Okay.
I just have to say, I wondered before I went to seminary, I intentionally took a class at Starr King on UU theologies to try to like make sure that the umbrella was actually big enough for me. And it was really clear by the end of that class, oh yes, this umbrella is big enough for me and what I might bring to this world. And I found that to always be true. I've never, in fact, in a way, I think being a UU Buddhist minister, uh, what I often say is that our kind of theist atheist dualism that we have in some of our congregations, Buddhism just like cuts across both of those, because it's not concerned with those questions.
Right.
It's like, here's a spiritual practice that theists can do and atheists can do. And it's just helpful. It's medicine. And I feel like everywhere I've served, even though there are lots of people that will never identify as Buddhists, they really have appreciated that that way that I'm a minister. And so I know I don't feel like they've ever been in conflict. I think in the Buddhist realm, most people don't know what a Unitarian Universalist minister does. But I think the way that I show up engaged is, again, it just reflects how I was brought up. So I cannot think of a place except perhaps when I was working full time, finding the space and time to really come from a contemplative place was not easy. And part of what I do now, I've been offering slow ministry coaching groups to colleagues because it was so difficult for me. It's not like I have all the answers, but I really want to support other colleagues, whatever their theological tradition is, to find a way to do ministry that is really, really sustainable.
Mm.
Yeah. So that's a lot of my focus these days.
Oh, what a gift. What
I
a
hope.
gift.
Yeah. Yeah. At least we become like a learning community. Like, okay, how can we support each other to do this? Because as you know, the work is hard.
It is.
Yeah. And we need spiritual practices too.
An hour a day, unless you're really, really busy, in which case 2 hours.
Yes, that was Gandhi.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I often quote that.
Yeah.
And I don't know a single minister, including me when I was full time, who ever had that. So yeah, I feel like it really needs to be both in the pews and in our own lives.
Are there any other thoughts on being trans-religious, bi-religious, however um, or just in general that you'd like to share before we sign off?
I would say that one of the things I saw in seminary, I went to the Graduate Theological Union, which Star King is part of that. There was at that point 9 seminaries, is that I was amazed at how many people, even in the much more traditional seminaries, actually were multi-religious, were in fact practicing across what we think of as kind of the strict lines of. So there were people who were Methodist and pagan. I've met a number of really incredible Catholic clergy, Catholic religious people who were also Zen Buddhist practitioners and sometimes teachers. And I just feel like there's a richness that comes from that. There's a lack of rigidity. And one of the things that I love, love, love about our faith is that we understand that we don't have to believe alike in order to do what we do together as a community and to be in covenant with each other. And I feel like that gives us room, really, to find what is our own particular medicine and then share that.
Lovely. Thank you.
Well, it's great to talk with you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of your service.
Yeah, well, thank you for agreeing, for accepting the invitation. I'm going to go ahead and hit stop now.